that serves kind of like a pathway or like a telephone line from tree to tree. And so the trees then can send messages to each other. We analyze the mathematical pattern of the linkages, and they've followed what's called a biological neural network pattern.
So they would look like the connections in your brain?
They do.
I want to welcome Suzanne Simard onto the program. Thank you for coming to hang out in our little bunkie here.
It's really cool to be here.
You are the author of the fantastic book, When the Forest Breathes, Renewal and Resilience in the Natural World, and you are a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia. So your work has, and I'll just go direct with this, it has changed my experience when I walk through a forest. So I thought maybe we could start there. If you and I are going through a walk right now, to understand how alive and communicative the forest is, where do we start? Where should we look?
Well, I think just be quiet with yourself and open yourself up to all of the dimensions that the forest is interacting with you. That includes the sounds, the wind, the smells, the crunch of the forest floor under your feet, the chattering of the squirrels, the river that might be flowing by, your own heartbeat, and you become one with the forest. It might take a second, it might take a few minutes, it might take you an hour. You might have to sit down and do it, but it's a really important personal experience that helps you connect with your home.
And underneath those footsteps and the crunch, there's a lot going on. There's a great quote from your book. My colleagues and I found that the below ground linkages had patterns suggestive of a biological neural network, that the trees have agency in the transmission of resources, and that together, these properties are suggestive of a type of intelligence. Intelligence, how so?
Well, so this biological neural network is really this network or this web of these mycelium, which is part of the mycorrhizal system. So a mycorrhiza is a fungus root association. Mm-hmm. Mycorrhiza literally means fungus root. That web, there's all kinds of compounds that are moving through that web of hyphae all the time. And the web can actually link up trees together. It can link plants together and trees together, depending on the species that are involved. But that serves kind of like a pathway or like a telephone line from tree to tree. And so the trees then can send messages to each other. And those messages can include simple things like amino acids or sugars, or they can be information chemicals that are far more complex than that. And they are sending these messages in response to each other's needs, to their presence, what's happening with them. So there's this constant back and forth going on through this mycorrhizal network. It's also going on through the soil. And I would say, just to expand things a little bit, there's also communication going on through the air.
Ooh, okay.
So there's all these infochemicals going back. You can actually smell them when you're in the forest,
What's
right?
the smell?
That resiny smell or that bouquet.
Yeah.
And those are trees that are communicating with each other about pollination or, whether they're under stress.
Yeah.
They're emanating things like terpenes that are also sort of like insect warning signals. And so there is this constant conversation above and below ground between these trees and plants in the forest.
Which feels like a form of intelligence.
Which feels like a form of intelligence. And so when we looked at these mycorrhizal networks and we actually we made maps of them and we analyzed the mathematical pattern of the linkages, and they followed what's called a biological neural network pattern.
Okay. So they would look like the connections in your brain.
They do, where you've got a few really large nodes and lots of little connecting nodes. That's what we have in our brains as well.
Right.
And then you have these linkages where you're having this transmission of information. The main chemical that's moving through the mycorrhizal network is a compound called glutamate. Mm-hmm. Glutamate is also the most common neurotransmitter in our brains. And so when I said it's a form of intelligence, I'm really talking about the physical structure and the physicality of the movement of information, the compounds, but it's also, that the forest itself functions like an intelligent system.
And your work in 1997 with the paper birch and the Douglas fir, who I guess we could say are great buddies. How did you find out that they were able to share resources and communicate with each other?
Yeah, so I was working in forests that I had worked in for a long, long time. And as a forest researcher, I was working for the Ministry of Forests in British Columbia at the time, and I was tasked with how to get rid of birch from these ecosystems.
Yeah.
And, it was at a time when the forest industry, and it still is focused on this idea of competition. You got to get rid of the competition for the conifers. And I started seeing that when we did that the Douglas firs, when we got rid of the birches, were getting sick.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in, there's more going on here than just competition. So I set up for my doctoral experiment birch and fir and a neighbor cedar. And birch and fir share many mycorrhizal species in common, and therefore can be linked together. Cedar forms another kind of mycorrhiza called an arbuscular mycorrhiza, and therefore has its other networks going on.
Yeah,
so
we've got cliques here.
Yeah, we've got a couple of cliques here. The cedar's not part of the clique.
Yeah.
So I wanted to see whether or not birch and fir were in communication through these mycorrhizal networks, or through the soil, or whatever other avenue might be happening. And so I set up this experiment where I grew these triplets together, and I labeled the Douglas fir with carbon-14 and the paper birch with carbon-13, a different isotope of carbon, and then I traced where those isotopes went. And what I found is it moved from birch to fir and from fir to birch. So it was going back and forth actually between the two trees. And then I did another thing, is that I shaded Douglas fir with trying to emulate this idea that the foresters had was, birch is going to shade Douglas fir and that's going to kill the fir.
Right.
So I thought, I'll shade it. I'll shade Douglas fir, sort of emulating the competition for light. And what I found, which is amazing, is that the more I shaded Douglas fir, the more carbon birch sent to fir.
Okay.
Right?
So this is real-time communication.
Yes, it is. And it also totally upsets their hypothesis that birch is only a competitor.
Right.
What birch is doing is it's facilitating fir even as it's shading it. So they really are in this dance together, and I kind of interpreted that it's better for the whole community if they're both thriving.
Right. So trees can be pals. They can have little cliques. They can help each other when they need resources, and they share. But what about family members? Can trees recognize kin and family and behave differently?
Yeah, so I'll sort of step a little bit back and talk about how we got to this question in the first place.
Yeah.
So the mycorrhizal network is in the forest. And so the next step was we wanted to map what these mycorrhizal networks looked like. And, I mentioned that it looks like a biological neural network with some big nodes and lots of little nodes. And so those big nodes were the big old trees. So the biggest and oldest the tree, the more highly connected they were to all the other trees. And so then I started saying, well, what are these big old trees doing? And so we started looking at how regeneration happens around the old trees. First, I just did some experiments with my students where we would grow seed, like any old seed of a Douglas fir or seedling, connected to the network or not connected to the network. And we found that those that could tap into the network that was supported by these big old trees, those survived better. Okay, so that's cool. So that means that these old trees are facilitating regeneration. So then the next question is, can they tell which ones are their own offspring? Would they benefit those ones even more? So we did a bunch of elaborate experiments with my grad students, especially Amanda Issei was very instrumental in doing this work. And we grew kin seedlings and stranger seedlings. So kin meaning that they were from the seed of the parent tree, and then a stranger from other trees that were nearby, but not of the same parentage. And we grew those with and without networks next to these mother trees. And we found that the kin seedlings had bigger root systems. They had more fitness traits, more buds, more height growth. And importantly, we traced carbon-13 moving from a sibling to another sibling, and we found that more moved to the kin.
Wow.
And that carbon ended up in the mycorrhizas of the kin seedlings. So that also benefited them.
Wow. So family matters in the forest.
Family matters. Kin recognition happens.
You mentioned sending signals through the air. And I remember watching this, I think it was a Planet Earth documentary, and it had this type of monkeys. I think they were vervet monkeys. And they would send each other warning sounds based on if it was a snake or an eagle. And it was this, really aha moment for people of, oh, there's a lot of intelligence going on here. Can trees do the same thing? Do they send each other warning signals?
They do,
Okay.
and I'm not the only one who's looked at this, but I'll tell you about what I've done with my group. Is that we grew Douglas firs and ponderosa pines. So in British Columbia, these are two important species. They're at the lower reach of the tree line, but in valley bottoms. And we started testing whether or not the Douglas fir and pine were in conversation or had a warning signal when they were being attacked by, in this case, by western spruce budworm. And keeping in mind that those forests have been under a lot of stress from the mountain pine beetle, western spruce budworm outbreaks, and these are getting more amplified as climate is changing. So it's important to know how these trees are responding. So we grew ponderosa pine and Douglas fir in the lab, that they normally grow side by side, and we infected the Douglas fir with western spruce budworm and then traced its physiology and its production of defense enzymes, which it immediately started to produce. And then it sends signals through its mycorrhizal network to the neighboring ponderosa pine, which is listening, and it upregulated its defense enzyme production, and it increased its defense against the budworm. So they were in communication, and they were, it was helping the neighbors be more resistant to the infection. This kind of work has been done elsewhere in other kinds of plants with the information going through the air.
Everything we've listed so far, if we saw those behaviors in a group of animals or mammals, we'd say, hey, okay, they're clearly intelligent and likely sentient. When we look at the forest, I'm curious if the one big difference is, other than lack of brains, is timescale. We have this bias of what communication is. It's this tennis match. We're engaged in it right now. That's what we've come to expect is communication and therefore intelligence. Do forests just move much slower?
Well, they do. I mean, they're much longer lived. And yet they're slow and yet fast. Because, so let me explain that. So, a tree, where I'm from, a cedar tree can grow 3,000 years of age, or a Douglas fir, hundreds of years. And so obviously the lifespan is much longer than our lifespan. So things happen over these long time scales. But it also happens really fast in that a tree is a microbiome, right? It's got fungi and bacteria and viruses associated with it that are all responding in much faster time. And so a tree, when you think of it as not just a single organism, like it's a multitude of organisms working together, that it's operating on like long time scales and fast time scales. So that means that it can respond over long periods, but it also can be very adaptive in real time.
I'm curious about some of the pushback you've gotten just on saying there's a lot more going on in the forest. There is intelligence there. There is communication. Why the pushback on that?
I think that, especially in the Western world, Western science has long thought that plants were just inert and things, just like scenery. And that comes from removing ourselves from the natural world, which has been happening over the last 1,000 years, really, where, we've separated mind from body, person from nature. We're objective observers of the environmental world. We're not part of the world. And so it's really easy to objectify plants and trees. And so, I think that's why there's been so much pushback on the idea of intelligence, that they're not intelligent. They're just these dumb plants. In fact, sometimes when we're insulting each other, we say, you're such a vegetable, right? Or he's in a vegetative state, right? It's like an insult. And yet here there are these creatures that are much longer lived than us. They're very adaptive. They're very perceptive to us and to each other.
They can perceive us in a certain way, where they're aware of us?
Well, they can perceive all kinds of things, right? So if I've done experiments where I've done things like, pulled all the needles off a tree and then measured its physiological response, it's immediate. Is that perception of what me?
Okay.
I think it is.
There's this great analogy I've always enjoyed about science, and it's like ripples in a pond. And so some people can be on the middle ripple and see a bunch of ripples ahead of them and be like, oh, everything's so certain, we know so much. But the folks that are on the edge of the ripple, like an Einstein or a Carl Sagan, they see this great expanse of all this stuff we don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think that relates to your relation to this science?
You know, there's some things that are not going to be knowable,
Yeah.
but we know that it's this system that is complex, adapting, changing all the time in it, and it's a self-regulating system. We don't have to know everything about that, but we know that it exists, and that it's it provides the scaffolding for life.
Right.
I don't have to know everything about that. And I, actually, lots of people don't, right? They already know that the Earth is a living system, and that we're part of it, and that how we behave, in a reciprocal or non-reciprocal way with Mother Earth is going to affect us.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a genius like Einstein, I think, to really understand that, and you don't have to know all the details.